covered under a collective bargaining agreement, you belong to a public sector union. What's really unique about public sector unions? Why do you think it deserves its own chapter? Yeah. Some are not. Absolutely. And who's not allowed to strike?
Like the servants. Not servants, sorry.
Civil servants, that's why you're saying that. But essential services. Yeah, so firefighters, nurses often aren't allowed to do a full-blown strike because they're deemed essential services. What else is unique? Yeah.
I don't know if this is the right answer, but because the employers and government, they have different standards because the charter rights don't apply.
You're almost on track. That's a really important point, especially for your short answer. So if you work for the government's your employer, but they're also the government. So they set the rules. So they're management, but they're also the rule setter for how all bargaining sort of happens. So it's unique in that way. Versus, if we work for a private company, and we're unionized and we have a disagreement with management, something to do with collective bargaining or something to do with our union or recognition, we go to the government to seek clarification. But in this case, it's sort of a double-edged sword because our boss is the government. So that's a really unique part about it. What's also unique, do you think that public sector workers are more likely or less likely to be unionized? More. So we know virtually almost all employees, I think it's the stats in your book, and I never look for stats, but it's something like 75 or 73% of public sector workers are unionized. And it's much, much lower in the private sector. So that's something else that's rather unique about the public sector as well. So most people are unionized. I spent the last 8 years before I came to Toronto and Ottawa, which is obviously a super government, heavy sort of civil servant town. And what's interesting about it is everybody sort of, if you ask all my students there what they want to do, their goal is to get a government job. That's often what they'll tell you without really understanding what it means necessarily. And then you'll often talk to adults who are working for the government, and they all have these side, and all is an exaggeration, but these side sort of passion projects because they often will tell you that they're bored at work. So we all know that the public sector civil service has connotations with the union, but they're more likely to be unionized, and it's tricky because the employer is the actual government. So another piece that your book sort of talks about, so they do have different legislative framework. I'm not going to be as concerned about all of the details around the legislative framework. I just want you to understand why the public sector unions are different, are special, and what impact that they've actually had on Canada. Here are the density rates. So this chart, so you can see here, public versus private sector, union coverage, union density. You should know the difference between those two, but I would never ask you to do a calculation. But you can see the public sector union density is about 71%, the private sector is about 17%. So dual role of the government, so their analogy is umpire and employer. The other big thing, and this would be really important if you had a short answer question that said what's different about public sector unions, is that often public services are a monopoly, both ways. So the government is the only one that offers firefighting services. They're the only one that in Ontario, for example, from a provincial perspective, sells liquor. They control all liquor. So that's something that's really interesting to know. Typically, when there's only one employer, what do you think that does to the workers? What's the impact on the workers? If there's only one place that can hire me. They don't have much options, right? So when you don't have much options, what happens? Typically, wages are lower, yeah? pensions when you look at a market when there's only one employer. And so unions sort of as a result have come up to try and force some equity in wages. If I asked you in general your opinions of how government employees were paid, what would you say? Well, what else? Anything else? Anyone feel the opposite? Yeah. Do they have crazy benefits? Yeah. Who's heard that? That government workers have crazy benefits? Yeah, that they're paid well, really well. Yeah, super high pensions usually, defined benefit pensions. So it's sort of that balance of that equity efficiency. So if there were no unions in the public sector and the government was the only employer, what would happen? The result might be that wages are quite low, benefits would be low, there might not be these pensions, but the unions have managed at the government to make sure that there's been more equity within those employers. The only last piece that I sort of want you to know about, history is not really that important. Why public sector unions have a lot of power. So primarily because typically if they go on strike, there's a big disruption to services that impact all of us. So remember the foreign workers strike that was going on at the beginning of this class? And that had, for a public sector union, probably a relatively low impact on the average Canadian. But if, firefighters or, TTC workers, who else, nurses, garbage. So if those people go on strike, or there's service disruption, it typically really impacts everybody quite negatively. So that gives the unions a bit more power, unless they're deemed an essential service. Demand is relatively inelastic, meaning, there's only one place, there's only one group of people who's going to come pick up your garbage. Other than, you have to call 1-800 got junk or something. But you can't go to an alternate hospital. There's just one hospital system. I'm sure someone will disagree, but you can't really buy alcohol outside of the LCBO. So, I don't want to know. And so essentially, the public, what happens is we will typically get really upset. People aren't coming to pick up our garbage, or we can't buy liquor, or we can't, be served at the hospital in a relatively good amount of time. So we tend to punish one party. Whoever we feel is most at fault. So do we think the government is being really inflexible, or do we have, less sympathy for the union and more sympathy for the government? So that, that plays a big role around public sector power. And I'm skipping slides you probably don't need to know though. I just wanted to ask some management issues. So management issues as a result of, so we know that in Ottawa, especially, does anyone know anyone in Ottawa or work for the government or there? So recently they've actually just laid off, I would say over the last 3 years, a lot of workers. So we actually have federally in Canada the smallest government we've had in about 50 years, meaning that Stephen Harper and the Conservatives have laid off, closed, consolidated a ton of federal government jobs and organizations. So that's really interesting to note because obviously that's shrinking public sector unions, which I'm sure they're not happy about, but it can be done. A lot of work now is being done through privatization. So we know Rob Ford for many reasons, but one of the things that he actually did do was privatize garbage collection in Toronto. So that, again, is a whole bunch of workers who would have historically been covered under the public sector unions who now are no longer. So we're seeing government and workers at all levels really start to shrink. Why do we think that is?
Yeah, it's a government's way of saving money when they privatize because the private organizations pay less. They don't get as much benefits. It's cost.
Definitely huge cost savings. So it's an easy way for the government to sort of pay people less, but without doing it themselves, because wages and benefits and pensions very easily, so it's easier to contract out that work. And then someone else is paying them, so you're not really responsible. Obviously, we talked about innovation a bit with the impact of unions on workplaces. That's probably something that you really want to think about, write some points down about in Chapter 10 in terms of the case study. So, what impacts do unions have? And, some of the things that, innovation is really hard to measure, but when we think of working at the government, what do we think of? What are adjectives that we would use to describe working for the government or government workers? Boring. What else? Lazy. Unproductive. Pardon? Strictly 9 to 5. Overpaid. Okay. That's like when you drive by the construction projects. Yeah. What else? So we typically, if I ask any class, we probably get the same tone of answers from everybody. So when we talk about efficiency and innovation, it's not necessarily adjectives we would use to describe the public sector and the government. So we don't think that, most of our government agencies are super innovative and necessarily really efficient. And it's a shame because I'm sure there are people at the government who work really hard and do an amazing job and have a big impact, but overall our sense of sort of public sector unions doesn't give us that image. And that's really what I want you to know about Chapter 11. So I'll never give page numbers, but as you're reading, you'll at least know. I'm not concerned very much about the history. I just want you to know what's different about them in terms of unions in Canada. Alright, so your assignment that is going to help you with your final. Okay, this is the case. And again, I'll post it on Moodle. It's up on our Twitter. It's quite long, so it's part of the Globe's Wealth Paradox series. But it's an interesting start about sort of Mark Lagerwey is one of the lucky ones. When he retired last year from Canadian Pacific Railway, he belonged to a group that is fast becoming an endangered species. Unionized employees who spend their entire working lives with the same company, earning handsome wages and a healthy guaranteed pension. And so the rest of the article really digs into sort of history, but just in general, what they're predicting is happening with unions in Canada, what work is going to look like. They tie a lot to inequality, but I'm more concerned about the union pieces and what that means for Canadians. So obviously read this article a couple times before you come in for your final. I'll figure out how to print it neatly on 1 or 2 pages, but it's about four pages long. I think this is the title. So one of the things that we're going to do today in our teams, and I'll break out your teams in just a second, is spend some time talking about what is going to happen to unions in Canada. And we're going to present some of our thoughts back to the class in a discussion that will likely be very closely related to one of the questions I ask you. So it's the more stuff that you come up with, the better prepared you'll be for your final. Chapter 12 deals with a lot of these issues, but I don't want to teach it to you and then ask you to regurgitate